the main point in question would be the Jesus myth. And that's the whole thing. Everybody is willing to look past everything in the New Testament and really not really pay so much attention to the rest of the book. But when it comes to Jesus, this person, did he exist? And, to me, it's just crazy. And it's, you could put Jesus on the same level as Moses, 500 years old, spending 100 years to build an ark. So it's the same type of stuff to me. So it has to be looked at. And the main thing is, you have people, supposedly people, pseudepigrapha, when you think about it, you have supposedly people coming forward, giving us these gospels about the so-called life of Jesus Christ. All, suspect things that are in question that we have to look at and examine to determine, what's the truth. Now, again, as I said, just as we went back and looked at Greek history, we can see it correspond with the Bible and fit Greeks, no Jews. It's going to be the same thing in the New Testament, and it's not a coincidence that it's written in Greek. Plain and simple, you got to pay attention to this stuff. How is it that for this long stretch, you have supposedly this Hebrew language that becomes a dead language, which we'll get into that, and then you have the injection of this totally new doctrine, totally new concepts called Christianity that comes and takes place right after this huge war of Rome and the so-called Jews. So, it's so much in question. There's so much that is suspect around this time frame that you've got to take a look at it to get the truth. It can't really be just accepted, by this book, by just, taking the Bible and just, saying it's completely true. We have to continue to put it into context with actual history and see where it fits. And does it fit nowhere? And that's the thing. So we're going to start to dig into this and take a look. So now, talked about this in the previous video about how you had during this time. We're talking about, right around the time before the War of the Jews. You have still, supposedly in the Jewish doctrine, this whole, prophecy of a warrior. A warrior Messiah coming forth and helping the Jews defeat the Romans. Because you have, according to their history, you have during this time the persecution of Jews. Jews being enslaved and Jews being basically, oppressed and, trying to live a normal life. They're being overtaxed by Rome and things are just, outrageous. So the Jews have repeated, skirmishes with the Romans to where you had a lot of young Jews rise up and try to take on the Romans and was defeated. Stuff like this kept happening over and over again. Now, you have this still. You got to understand, one, you have this whole hatred, this whole animosity with the Jews and the Romans. So, when you have Jesus coming in and his doctrine just doesn't fit with that time frame, as I talked about. It just doesn't fit, where you would have supposedly a Jew walking around Galilee and Jerusalem, preaching, turn the other cheek, preaching to love thy neighbor, preaching. Remember, Jesus says, render to Caesar all things that is basically Caesar, basically pay your taxes. None of this kind of talk would have fit in with the Jews around this time. They would not have tolerated anybody talking like that. They probably would have thought that that person was a spy. So it's far-fetched that, Jesus would be walking around in Jerusalem, Galilee, or what have you, in Israel, preaching this kind of doctrine for so long, and during a time when there was so much war going on between the Jews and the Romans. So this has a history to it. It's a lot to this point that you have to understand. It's basically going back to the War of the Diadochi. So you have with the Seleucid Empire, remember they took over the territory, which part of it would be Israel. Now you have the Hasmoneans, which we know as the Maccabees, basically rise up and fight for their independence, and they would get it around 163, 164 BCE up until about 63, 64 BCE, where they were basically reconquered. Rome came in and took over and re-obtained those lands that the Greeks once owned, And Rome took over, and all the fight and everything that the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, or what have you, done been through, all the fighting was basically, for naught. They had to basically start over again and deal with a whole new, even worse regime than the Greeks. So, Rome came in, took over, and basically set them back. And they was dealing with the oppression of Rome, since then. So now, who was in Israel around this time still? This is the 2nd century BCE. You still have a lot of Africans in Israel. You have a mixed group now, because during this time you had a lot of Edomites or Arabs coming in to Israel, coming into those lands. You have basically now the mixing. You have Greek, you have African, you have Arab in and out of this town, of this place. So it's the same thing. When you go back and look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics, when they showed you who the citizens of Egypt was everybody. You had white, you had African, you had Arab. You can see clear as day how they presented them. This was basically what it looked like throughout, with the so-called Middle East, with the majority before conquest being African people. And that's something that we know. So the rulers, or the people that was in power, or the main majority of the land and everything, belonged to us, of course. And we were in power, of course, until we were conquered. So you have all that going on. So they got to remember, around the time when these wars are happening with the Greeks and then the Romans and the Arabs and everything, the Africans are slowly trickling out of Israel down into lower Africa and other places. And it will eventually be overrun by Arabs and the Greeks, or what have you, which would, give us the Berbers and everything like that. So important to note that. So now history notes the fact that you have these Arabs coming in. They call them the foreigners from Edom, which Edom would be in Arabia. So we're talking about Arabs here. So what would happen, you would have a lot of these Arab groups come in and take over smaller lands from the people, from African people. And what they didn't know was a lot of these lands was controlled by Rome, and Rome didn't care who was living on the land. They taxed the people that was there. So they would come in and basically tax the Arabs, who basically had no clue when they set out to conquer that Rome was taxing these people. So this is where basically Antipater comes in. And Antipater was basically an Edomite or Arab who his family had converted to Judaism, and he would basically get into politics and basically try to pick up where the Maccabees and everybody who was having a problem with Rome, he would basically fit in with the politics of that time, what the Maccabees was talking about, and everybody who had an issue with the taxation of Rome, he would appeal to those people. But at the same time, he was playing both sides. He was also kissing Rome's ass and doing what they wanted them to do. So he knew how to play both parts so well that Julius Caesar basically appointed him as procurator of Judea in 47 BCE, and Caesar basically had him keeping the people in line. Now later his son will basically become governor. We know him as Herod. Herod will be king by the time that Jesus is born and died. So you have this history connection right up front already of Rome having connections with the Arabs. It's important to establish this early, that you have a Roman Caesar who is working with Arabs during this time, because this just makes sense as we go forward. So you have Antipater comes in, he plays both sides, as I said. He moves up in rank, and his son becomes governor. And this is kind of sort of basically what we see them do. Same thing as you'll see later on with Spain, is when Rome comes in and assumes power, they never put their people in that position. They always use the people who they conquered to control the people. So it's the same type of MO. So if we're conquering Africans, or if we're conquering Arabs, or what have you, or a religious group, we can't put one of our people on the throne. We got to put one of their people on the throne that we own to run things. So then, none of our people get hurt, or nobody knows who the true power is. So this is what Rome was doing. And you had these sellouts, just like we still got sellouts today, who was basically siding with Rome, the power, in exchange for money or, power, or what have you. So Antipater would do so, and his son, Herod, will become governor. And they would basically control certain areas. So when we look at the Seleucid Empire, excluding Israel, it's basically the same as the Parthian Empire. So a lot of people get confused around this time. You have to understand when you see kings in the same region, like they'll tell you it's the king of Mesopotamia, but then you'll find another king around the same date. You got to understand you have two separate groups of people appointing rulers, governors, or what have you. So you have the Parthians who claim this land to be theirs. You have the Seleucids who claim this land to be theirs. And you have for a long time wars go back and forth between the Seleucids and the Parthians until Rome came and assumed power from the Seleucids. And then you had the Parthians basically going to war with Rome. This lasted for a long time. So you have the Jews. Now, according to them, the Jews are basically being conquered in Israel, first by the Greeks, then later by the Romans. But understand, this is again a cover-up for who was really being conquered, which was the African people. So let's just understand that. But we'll go by their interpretation of the history for right now. So supposedly, Jews being conquered by the Seleucids, then later the Romans, and they had this whole prophecy that a warrior would basically come and lead them to war and victory against the Romans. So now enters Antigonus II Metatius. His father was Aristobulus II, who was priest king of Judea when the Maccabees ruled for 3 years. Remember, they fought the Seleucid Empire and defeated them in the War of the Maccabees, where they ruled for about 3 years until Rome came to power and basically took over. When they did so, they basically threw in prison Aristobulus and his son Antigonus II, and they put them in prison in Rome. So later, Antigonus II would escape and go back to Judea, where he found out that his uncle had basically sold out to Antipater. Remember, Caesar put Antipater in power. His son was Herod, who was governor of Judea, basically. So he went and saw that, sold out. Not just him, a lot of the Jews were selling out around this time to Rome because Rome was in power. And he basically thought that because of everything that took place and the fact that he was rightfully king and he could rule better because it was rightfully his spot because his father was king, he actually tried to get his kingdom back. He actually went to Caesar and basically pleaded to Caesar to give him back his kingdom, and that his uncle and everything that was going on was some kind of sham. And of course Caesar didn't do it. So what Antigonus did was he got together a small army and he went and fought against Herod, who basically defeated them. And Antigonus basically had to get a bigger army, and that's exactly what he did. He went out and he basically appealed to the rich people in Judea, the richer Jews, the people who had businesses and stuff like that, that they couldn't stand Rome. And Rome was taxing the crap out of them, and they had problems and issues with Rome. So he got them to, put up money, put up gold, got a lot of men to join. And the Parthians, he got the Parthians to basically come to war with him. He offered them a lot of gold. So you had this war. Parthians, Antigonus, going back into Jerusalem, where they defeated Herod. And Herod went and basically flee to Rome to tell the Romans what happened, that, they basically came in and took power from him. And, Rome was like, well, we're not going to recognize Antigonus as king. We're going to appoint you king. So Rome, without even fighting no war or doing anything else, not knowing the situation that they were in, had already, crowned Herod king of Judea, sent him back with Mark Antony's army to basically fight against the Parthians and Antigonus. So they won. They won that war, and they basically slowly defeated and conquered parts of Jerusalem until they pushed Antigonus into basically a corner. Him and the last bit of his men was basically stuck until the end of the winter. When the winter was over, the army went in there and basically defeated them and captured Antigonus and took him back to Antioch, where he was supposedly crucified and beheaded. So you have Josephus saying that he was beheaded. You have Cassius Dio, who was basically a Roman historian or what have you, who said that he was crucified. So you had these stories where Scholars say he was crucified, some say he was beheaded, some said both. The reason why this is important, of course, is because crucifixions was done before Jesus Christ, of course. But we're going to get back to the story of this crucifixion later because it's important. It fits in. So now, as I said, the Jews was looking for a fighting Messiah, and they got that with Antigonus. Antigonus, he was a warrior, and he put together armies, and he went after Rome not once but twice, multiple times. He went after Rome until he was killed. So a lot of the Jews looked at this as a prophecy that was fulfilled. But, once he died and they was back in the same position, they had to, start all over again. Now, as I said, we can go back and look and prove that a lot of the history that we find, the so-called history we find in the Bible, we can trace back to Greek actual history. And that it's just been plagiarized and transformed into something else and put into the Bible as actual history. But it doesn't fit with no other people on the planet except for the Greeks. So it's the same thing with the Romans, as I said. Same thing with the Romans. When you go back, you start looking at their history of conquest and the things that they went through in their history, there you can start to find parts of the Bible and the New Testament that fits with their actual history. It's no different from the Greeks. So Antigonus was crucified, and the Parthians basically had to go back to little skirmishes back and forth with the Romans. All of this is before the birth of Jesus Christ. So now, after Antigonus was crucified, what happened was, things got worse for the Jews. You would have so many of the priests bought off by Rome, and they would basically sell out. So one of the earliest mentions of a collection plate is during this time, because Rome would basically, while they was in the temple, would tax them right then and there in the temple, and they would send the temple authorities around with collection plates to collect taxes from the people, the Jewish people inside the temple. So just like how we have Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson today to basically keep the black folks in line, it was the same thing for the temple priests back then. Temple authorities, they was basically bought off to try to keep the Jews calm and keep them from rebelling, because they had this history of just constantly rebelling. You had a lot of the youth who would put together groups, and they would always continue to try to start a rebellion or a war with Rome. And this went on for a while. So the temple priests and these people was bought off and put in power to basically try to keep the Jews calm and keep them from trying to rebel and revolt against Rome. So we had this going for a while, and eventually, of course, we would get the Jewish War, because the Jews couldn't take it much longer. The taxation and so many different things that was going on, Jews basically had it, and it's not clear 100% as to what sparked the Jewish War, but it's believed to be so many different things. But in any case, you had Titus Flavius, what have you, the Romans, let's just say, go in and basically start destroying the Jewish temple. War broke out. Jews was defeated. Temple was basically burnt down. They went on a week, month, or however long burning spree where they supposedly took Jewish manuscripts and books or what have you and burnt them all, which is supposedly the reason for them hiding the Dead Sea Scrolls, because Rome was going out and taking everything that the Jews had and supposedly burning it up. Now, history does support this whole Roman book burning and everything like that, and it's a reason for that, of course, when we're going to go back and look. But it would make sense for them to do all this because of the fact they knew they wanted to, in the future, control history. So you have to get rid of the past. Things have to be changed. And one of the main things that had to be changed was language, of course, which we're going to get into. So they went out, they burnt every book they can find, manuscripts or what have you. And this basically led to the Jews, scattering and basically separating from out of Judea and enter in now the control Arabs and the Greeks, and they would basically occupy Israel, up until now, and mixing and everything like that. And this is how they came to be. But Rome would basically come in and control that land for good and not have no more rebellions or problems from the people until they got their religion in place. Now, that's sometime after this, after the whole Jewish war, After you start to see Judaism kind of sort of dwindle and disappear for a while. It's sometime around this point where the New Testament was established, and they basically established it because of that reason. You had a lot of the doctrine gone, a lot of the Jews was lost, and it was the perfect time for them to basically inject their doctrine. So we still got to go back and look at the fact that you have Antigonus, who basically was walking around saying he was the rightful king of the Jews, and he was crucified. Later, same thing would happen with Jesus. He would, go around preaching he's the Son of God, King of the Jews, and he was crucified. So we have to look at that comparison. I definitely don't think it was a coincidence that this is happening. You also have to look at the fact that you have Acts. In Acts 11:26, it says that basically they were first called Christians in Antioch, and Antioch is where Antigonus is basically crucified. So I definitely don't think that's a coincidence that it's saying that they was first called Christians in Antioch, probably because when Antigonus was killed, they would later use that crucifixion as a story for Jesus Christ. So you have the Jews under the conquest of the Greeks for a period of time. Hellenistic Jews that was Hellenized supposedly and converted into the Hellenistic doctrine, whatever that is. And as I said to you guys, there was no such thing as no Jews back then, and that the people that was Hellenized was actually Africans in African territories. And basically, this doctrine of Judaism was created and forced on these Africans to go out and spread. And when you go and look deeper into Judaism, as I said, you have ancient Greek mythology in the Old Testament with, Pandora's box, Eve, and Deucalion and Pharaoh, Noah's Ark, so on and so forth. So, again, when you go back and start looking at a lot of these stories, especially told by Europeans, you can't really give a lot of this stuff validity. I mean, it's really hard to put into context. Now, with these stories about the, Antigonus and his father, what have you, it's more to support these stories than biblical stories. These are not biblical stories. It's actually Roman history. So we can look at these and give validity to it, but it doesn't fit again with what the Bible has been telling us and what the actions of the Romans would be if they actually believed in this so-called Jesus or what have you. It's like, okay, so you have the Old Testament Jews, right, who, if the Septuagint is correct, these people are supposedly chosen people and everything like that. Why would Rome go and oppress these Jews? Why would they mess with these Jews if these are supposedly God's chosen people? Now, according to them, around this time, Septuagint is alive and well. So the Old Testament. So Rome would have to look at this and say, well, these people are chosen. We can't do this stuff to these people, but they do it. This is how you can look at it and say, well, it doesn't fit. It's some bullshit. Because when Rome took power, they would basically carry on Hellenization. The only way you would do such a thing is if you are the same people. You have the same agenda. And that's exactly what it was. So we can look at the story. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit with biblical history. It doesn't fit with the actions of the Greeks and the Romans. Why do such a thing? If you would later basically just jump on the religion and piggyback off of it and give us Christianity. So, and then say, well, everything that the Jews was talking about was real because we have it in our doctrine called the Bible. It don't make sense. So you are oppressing the Jews and everything that's happening with the Jews, but you agree that these are chosen people. It don't fit. So we got to look at that. But again, you have Jesus, as I said, walking around. All the stuff that's been happening to the Jews. You have Jesus walking around preaching to basically forget about it, turn the other cheek. Love your masters. Servants, obey your masters. It says, again, in Romans. You have a book of Romans in the New Testament. But how would any Jew fall for that? If you're following the whole biblical series that I've been putting out, I mean, just so far where we at. Everything the Jews been through. I mean, everything these people been through. You get up to Jesus and it's like change. This dude comes along and he has a whole new set of rules. Basically telling the Jews for hundreds of years, you've been praying wrong. This is the way you're supposed to pray. The whole thing has changed. The promise of God has changed now. Everybody can be saved. You are not the chosen people no more. So forget about the whole prophecy thing that, you disobeyed God and now you cursed and all that stuff supposed to happen. No matter no more, because everybody can be saved through Jesus. So everything's different. Everything's changed. So what you basically have is, Rome seeing an opportunity once Judaism basically dwindled or whatever it was. They seen an opportunity, as I said, to basically create their doctrine and instill it, because now you have the Jews scattered and a lot of these people in the territory now looking for a religion or a doctrine to believe in. Now, if it's true and they did go and burn a lot of the manuscripts and a lot of the books that the Jews had, then it's not a real clear understanding on what the religion was. And as I said, they do things generationally. So they indoctrinate the children and then so on and so forth. This is how it's done. This is how they can get the belief system, to continue or to begin. And what they basically did was create the doctrine. Plain and simple. It's not a coincidence that it's written in Greek, just as the Old Testament was. And again, we never had any Old Testament written in Hebrew. And it's something you got to look at. You got to remember. And this is another one of the crazy parts, because I don't think Hebrew is as old as people think it is. And it's hard to understand. Okay, you have, Ptolemy II Philadelphus wanting a translation of the Hebrew law to Greek. Okay, so 6 elders. So 70 elders total to come and do this translation. Suffice it to say that it had to be some people still left speaking Hebrew around this time. You got the 70 elders. We can say that, the Hebrew language was going strong. If you got 70 elders to come and do a translation, first of all, if you never had an understanding or a translation of the Hebrew law, why would you want one? What is the point of having one? Why would you go through all this, as I talked about with the LXX letters of Orestes? Why would you want this translation? I mean, again, it doesn't fit with the actual true actions of the Greeks for them to actually go through all this and get this translation. It don't work. It doesn't fit. So to do this translation, and you have the Septuagint, and it seems as if, just the Hebrew language vanishes. It just disappears. So remember, you had all this time, from the time of the Septuagint up until the creation of the Vetus Latina, all these Jews in between this time is speaking Greek. No one is speaking Hebrew. We have Aramaic, which we know Jesus was supposed to have spoken, and the people that was in Judea during that time were speaking Aramaic, not Hebrew. You have Aramaic, you have Syriac. Now, it's one of the biggest things people confuse, because they think a lot of the people that's in Israel right now and speaking Hebrew, when they speak in Yiddish, they speak in a different form of so-called Hebrew or Paleo-Hebrew, which they always get into the Paleo-Hebrew crap, try to cover up the language. But remember, you have the Hebrew language basically becoming a dead language, and it wasn't until, I believe, the 1800s, 1886 I think it was, when they started to basically re-spark and re-speak Hebrew. I mean, just think about that. You have now, during this time, okay, you have Rome giving us the New Testament. You have Rome giving us all these different versions. You had the Vetus Latina, then you had the Latin Vulgate. You have all the codexes, Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, all these codices. And then you have between 700 and 1000 BCE, we began to get our Hebrew manuscripts with the Masoretic texts. Then you had the Aleppo Codex, and you have the Leningrad Codex. All this between 700 and 1000. And also in between that time, you have the creation of the Quran. So you have, again, you got to look at it, pay attention, something that's fishy. You have the fall of Judea, supposedly. And then all of a sudden, we get the New Testament. We get finally, we get a Hebrew codex. We get the Quran. We get all these biblical manuscripts, and religion basically begins to take over and rule. Plain and simple. And at the head of it, you have the Romans. Plain and simple. It's not a coincidence all this is going on. We can't take any of this stuff and put any validity into it coming from the same people. The people who oppressed us, people who enslaved us. Plain and simple. The people who, by their own admission, was basically going against the Bible while giving the world the Bible. So if you want to look at it, you have basically a complete, turnaround. If you want to go from the whole thing, you have the Greeks conquering and establishing these doctrines with Judaism and using it to rule. You have Rome come in and basically assume power. So the doctrine changes to what they would later use to establish more power and gain more control of countries or what have you. So, religion had its time. It had its time where it ruled and it was set in place, and many different civilizations used it to control the people, and that's what it was about. But Rome was always behind it, and we can see where Christianity popped up at in different countries. You had this taxation from the Pope, from Rome. These places was paying taxes, and the Pope basically had religious laws that people were supposed to follow that would basically benefit the empire. And, we can see this with England, and the reason why, they was controlled by Rome, and the tax money that they paid them, and how everything was set up to benefit the Roman Empire, who by that time was super powerful. But we got to still, go back and look at all this stuff and how they can explain that this language that's supposed to have been spoken in ancient and everything like that seems to have been, gone for so long and just popped up. And now a lot of people are speaking it. That's one of the major keys to the Hebrew thing that I think they don't understand, is how you keep talking about Hebrew and you're supposed to have this language and we can't find it. For all these years, hundreds of years, you had the people reading from a Greek Septuagint, a Greek manuscript, supposing Jews reading Greek. The Hebrew is supposed to have an oral tradition where they kept the doctrine orally. So you would expect the language to be, kept as well. So for that language not to be passed down and kept orally with the Jews is crazy. You only see it later on, and that's what people get confused. You have them talking about stuff that they put in place after the fact that was never in place, before the fact. So all the stuff they saying that, the Hebrew is supposed to have this oral tradition and the Hebrew is supposed to have these manuscripts, we can't find none of this stuff. And the reason why we can't, because these people didn't exist. The people that we're talking about and all this stuff, this conquering in these wars, we're talking about African people that was doing all of this. This is all dealing with African people and us basically trying to keep and fight for the territory we had that Rome was trying to take from us. And it's a history that we see clear as day with Rome. Even I was talking about before with the Aksum Empire. Rome's coming in and they're basically stealing stuff. And you had the whole war with Haile Selassie in Rome. This is history. This real history that you don't see in the history books that they're keeping from people. It doesn't fit with biblical history at all and the actions of these people. Stuff is made up. And that's the point of this video, to get you to understand that these chunks, this history that we're talking about from the conquest of the Greeks all the way up until the installment of the Roman Empire and the creation of biblical religion as we know it, we can't follow none of this stuff. It's all bullshit. We don't know what's real and what's not. We can't find no real proof except for the fact that we know we had these established wars between the people of that land and the Roman Empire, plain and simple. And you can look at it as simple conquest and them just taking lands, whatever like that. But we got to look deeper at it and see that this is the implementation of a doctrine that they would use to basically, take over. So now all of this will be obvious, especially the whole part with the language. People just looking at that and saying, well, I just can't accept the fact that for so long these people didn't speak Hebrew. And then it just comes out of nowhere as this established ancient language that these people supposed to have spoken, but clearly didn't, because we don't find any manuscripts or anything or any biblical anything in Hebrew before the Septuagint Greek. And by their own admission, these people were speaking Greek, reading Greek, speaking Aramaic, Syriac, no Hebrew. It's like the proudest thing that you are proud of, you didn't even do during ancient times. It don't make no sense. So then you have later on, we have Dr. Joseph Yehuda giving us the Hebrew is Greek book, where he proves that the Greeks created Hebrew and Arabic. So that all fits in with everything that we are seeing with the Roman Empire giving us later, the manuscripts.